Unbelievable, Ingrid Keller thought, and the word landed in her mind like a stone dropped into still water, because nothing in her life had prepared her for the sound of an American city treating her like a human being. The truck's canvas flap had been rolled up just enough for air to slip in, cold and clean, carrying a smell she couldn't place at first. Not smoke from ruins. Not damp straw from a barracks. Something else, fresh bread, maybe, and roasted coffee, and the faint bite of gasoline that meant engines were running for ordinary reasons. Ingrid sat with her hands in her lap, fingers folded the way she had learned to keep them when fear wanted to make her fidget. Around her, other German women in plain uniforms held themselves the same way, quiet, stiff, eyes forward, as if the smallest movement might invite punishment. The vehicle slowed. Tires hissed over wet pavement. Through the opening, Ingrid saw storefronts with big glass windows, bright signs, and a barber pole spinning like it belonged to a world that hadn't cracked. People walked on sidewalks in coats and hats, carrying paper bags, their faces relaxed in a way that made Ingrid's throat tighten. A woman laughed at something a child said. A man held a door for someone he didn't know. Nobody looked like they were waiting to spit. Nobody stood with stones in their hands. And that was the first shock, sharper than any insult. The crowd did not surge toward the truck. It simply flowed around it, as if prisoners were not the center of the universe. Ingrid had been taught that the enemy's cities were traps, places where hatred lived in daylight. She had expected ropes, chains, a show. She had expected the humiliating proof that she was less than the people who owned these streets. The truck came to a stop near a curb-painted pail, the kind of small detail that suggested someone had time to care about lines. A voice outside gave a short instruction, calm and clipped, in English. Then boots on pavement. The rear door opened. Cold air rushed in, bringing the sound of a streetcar bell somewhere down the block. Ingrid's pulse counted each sound. A man stepped into view. American uniform, clean-shaven, posture straight, but not theatrical. His name patch read Whitaker. Staff Sergeant Jack Whitaker. He did not shout. He did not smile, either. His face held the neutral focus of someone doing a job that mattered, but not a job that required cruelty. "All right," he said, and his German was imperfect but careful, like he had practiced it the way a man practices tying a knot he hopes he never needs. "Step down. Stay together. Walk with me." Ingrid waited for the next part, for the order to bind their wrists, for the metal to appear, for the tug that would remind her body what her status was. Instead, Whitaker simply stood back and offered his hand to the first woman stepping off the truck, not as a gesture of friendship, but as a practical solution to a high step and slick pavement. The woman hesitated, then took it. No yank, no twist, just a steady grip and release. Ingrid's eyes dropped to Whitaker's belt out of habit. She saw no restraints being prepared for them. No ropes, no cuffs, nothing. Her mind tried to correct the scene, to force it into the shape of what she had been told. Surely this was temporary. Surely the city was the stage before the humiliation. But the street stayed ordinary. A dog on a leash paused to sniff a lamppost. A newspaper boy shouted a headline Ingrid couldn't understand, and his voice sounded bored, as if even war had become routine. Ingrid stepped down when her turn came, boots meeting pavement with a soft, final thud. She kept her chin level. She kept her gaze forward. She did not reach for anything. She did not speak. Yet inside, a question started to form. Quiet, stubborn, dangerous. If they could bind her and chose not to, what did that say about the story she had lived inside for years? Whitaker began to walk, and the women followed in a tight line. Ingrid felt every inch of distance between herself and the truck, every footstep like a test. She expected a hand to shove her shoulder. She expected a voice to cut her down. Instead, the only pressure she felt was the wind lifting the edge of her coat and the weight of strangers' eyes that did not linger too long. Some people glanced, curious. Some didn't look at all. And in that absence, in that refusal to make her into a spectacle, Ingrid felt something unfamiliar tighten and loosen at the same time. The city did not welcome her. It did not hate her, either. It simply existed, busy and bright, with enough confidence to let an unbound enemy walk through it and remain, somehow, still American. Ingrid kept her eyes on the line of Jack Whitaker's shoulders, not because she trusted him, but because the shape of his pace gave her something measurable in a place that felt unreal. He did not walk fast, the way guards did when they wanted fear to do the work for them. He walked like a man moving a group through a public space without inviting trouble. The women stayed close, boots landing in near unison, a small discipline that cost them less than speaking. Ingrid counted details the way she counted breaths. A flag over a post office. A chalkboard sign outside a diner with the word pie written in looping letters. A storefront window filled with radios, their polished dials catching sunlight. Everything was bright in a restrained, practical way, as if the city believed beauty did not need to announce itself. Ingrid's mind kept trying to build a hidden corner into every street, a place where someone would step out and turn the ordinary into a lesson. But nothing shifted. The sidewalk stayed a sidewalk. The sky stayed a pale winter blue. A streetcar rumbled past, metal wheels singing briefly, then fading. She realized she had been waiting for hate to show itself the way smoke shows itself, and the absence of it made her uneasy. Behind her, one of the younger women, Greta, made a small sound that might have been a question. Ingrid did not turn. Questions were dangerous. Questions made you visible. Whitaker glanced back once, not sharply, and spoke without raising his voice. "Keep your line," he said in German that carried an American rhythm. "No one will touch you if you do not give them a reason to get close." The sentence landed heavier than it should have, because it carried an assumption Ingrid did not know how to accept, that strangers in this city had rules they would follow. They passed a corner where a man sold newspapers. His hands were stained with ink. His face was wind-reddened. He looked at the women, then at Whitaker. For a moment, Ingrid expected his mouth to twist into something ugly. Instead, he only nodded once, a quick motion that could have meant anything, and went back to stacking papers. Ingrid felt her jaw tighten. A nod was not forgiveness. A nod was not welcome. It was something else, recognition without theater. A car rolled by, slow, dark green, with a family inside. The driver's eyes flicked toward the group. The passenger, a woman with curled hair and a neat collar, watched Ingrid for 2 seconds longer than polite. Ingrid held her gaze steady, then looked away first, not from shame, but from habit. The car continued. Nothing happened. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Ingrid had heard all week. She could feel her own heart working, stubborn and physical, as if it did not trust the world to remain consistent. She noticed Whitaker's hands. They were bare in the cold, knuckles slightly pink. A simple watch sat on his wrist, the kind that looked issued rather than chosen. When he adjusted his glove strap, he did it without fuss, not performing toughness. That, too, unsettled her. Men who did not perform were harder to predict. The line turned down a narrower street where the buildings leaned closer, brick and painted wood. The smell of coffee grew stronger, warm and bitter. Ingrid's stomach responded before her pride could stop it. She hated that. Hunger was a betrayal because it made you want. Wanting made you weak. Yet her body did not care about ideology. It cared about heat and bread and the simple math of survival. Greta whispered again, softer this time. "Why are we not tied?" Ingrid heard it anyway. Ingrid swallowed. The answer she had rehearsed for years did not fit the evidence in front of her. She did not have permission to invent a new one. Whitaker stopped near a small shop with a window fogged from warmth inside. He turned to face them, and for the first time Ingrid saw fatigue in his eyes, not as softness, but as the weight of too many days. "You are here for work detail," he said. "You will follow directions. You will go back when I say. That is all." Then he paused, as if deciding whether the next sentence mattered. "You will not be bound," he added, quieter. "Not unless you try to run." The word run hung in the cold air. Ingrid did not imagine herself running. She imagined herself collapsing into the idea of it, the way a drowning person imagines, sure. But she also imagined the miles, the language, the faces. Freedom was not a door. Freedom was an ocean. And Ingrid stood on the edge of it with her hands empty, unchained, and still unsure whether the water was real. Whitaker pushed the shop door open with his shoulder, and a small bell above the frame rang once. Bright and ordinary, the kind of sound Ingrid had not heard in a long time without it being followed by an order. Warmth spilled out, heavy with the scent of coffee and sugar, and the women hesitated at the threshold as if heat itself might be a trick. Ingrid stepped in last, keeping her distance from the counter, eyes scanning the room the way she had learned to scan any new space. A few tables. A glass case with pastries lined up like something from a picture book. A man in an apron behind the counter with sleeves rolled to the elbow, wiping his hands on a towel, his face set in concentration rather than suspicion. Two customers looked up. One turned back to their cup. The other stared openly for a moment, then lowered their eyes, as if remembering there were manners even in wartime. Ingrid's mouth went dry, not from fear alone, from the smell. The body knows bread the way the heart knows loss. Whitaker kept his voice low, speaking to the man in English Ingrid could not follow, the words moving fast, clipped by habit. Money changed hands. Ingrid noticed the simple way it happened, without drama. The man in the apron did not reach for a phone. He did not stiffen. He simply nodded once and began to fill paper cups. That gesture, small and practiced, struck Ingrid as more powerful than shouting. It said, "This is still a shop. I still sell coffee. The war does not get to own every inch of my morning." Whitaker turned back holding a tray with several cups and a small paper bag folded at the top. He did not offer it like a gift. He offered it like a tool, something that would make the next hour go better. "Drink," he said in German, and the words sounded strange in this warm room, as if it belonged to a different language than the smell of cinnamon. Greta took a half step back. Another woman, older, tightened her lips and shook her head. Ingrid felt the same reflex, the same instinct to refuse anything that could make them indebted, anything that could later be named as favor. Her mind whispered the old warnings. Nothing is free. Kindness is bait. You will pay for it. She watched Whitaker's face for a crack of impatience. He did not show one. He set the tray on the counter and reached into the bag. He pulled out a small pastry, broke it cleanly in half with his hands, and ate a piece without looking at them, as if he were proving something to himself rather than persuading them. He chewed once, swallowed, then took a sip from one cup. The motion was simple. The message was clear. No tricks. No hidden lesson. Ingrid realized she had never been trained to recognize an honest demonstration. She had only been trained to look for traps. The man in the apron watched quietly, his towel in his hands. Ingrid met his eyes for a fraction of a second. There was caution there, yes, but also something else, a firmness that did not need to harden into hate. He looked away first, returning to his work, giving her the strange dignity of being treated like someone who could exist without being watched. Whitaker slid a cup closer to Ingrid, stopping it a few inches from her hand. "It is just coffee," he said, and his German stumbled on the last word, but his meaning did not. Ingrid stared at the cup. The steam rose in thin ribbons, vanishing into the air like breath. Her fingers remained still. She felt the eyes of the other women on her, waiting for her choice to become theirs. She was not their leader, but fear makes leaders out of whoever moves first. Ingrid lifted her hand slowly, not reaching, not snatching, just placing her fingertips against the paper cup. It was hot enough to sting pleasantly. Heat without harm. She brought it closer, close enough to smell it fully, bitter and rich. Her throat tightened again, this time for a reason she did not want to admit. It smelled like mornings before the world broke. Ingrid raised the cup to her lips. The first sip was too hot, and she stopped, exhaled, tried again. The taste was strong, slightly burned, sweetened more than she preferred. Yet the sweetness did something cruel and gentle at once. It reminded her that ordinary life still existed somewhere, intact enough to be poured into a cup and handed across a counter. Her shoulders eased by an inch. Around her, Greta took her cup with shaking hands. The older woman accepted a pastry, then looked embarrassed by how quickly she bit into it. No one spoke. There was nothing safe to say. The bell above the door rang again as someone else entered, paused, then stepped around the group with a polite "excuse me," as if prisoners and citizens were simply bodies sharing the same narrow space. Ingrid watched that person pay, thank the man in the apron, and leave, the transaction so normal it felt like a miracle. Whitaker looked at his watch, then at the women. 5 minutes, he said. Then we go. Ingrid understood that even this kindness had borders. But for 5 minutes, she stood in a warm American shop with an unbound wrist and a paper cup in her hands, and the world did not punish her for it. The thought that followed was quiet and frightening. If this was real, then some of the stories she had lived by were not. Outside, the cold met Ingrid's face again, sharp enough to make her eyes water, and for a moment she hated the air for reminding her that warmth could be temporary. Whitaker guided them back into motion with a small tilt of his head, not a shove, not a barked command. The women tightened into their line as if the sidewalk itself demanded discipline. Ingrid carried the last taste of coffee like a secret, bitter and sweet at the same time. She did not look back at the shop window, because she did not trust herself not to look hungry. They walked 2 blocks, then 3, and the city kept offering the same steady evidence. People going about their day were present only as posters, ration signs, and a distant uniform here and there. Ingrid noticed a sign taped inside a grocer's window, sugar limit 1 pound. Another, save kitchen fats for explosives. She understood enough English to catch the meaning. The war lived here, too, but it lived alongside manners. That, more than anything, unsettled her. The line passed a schoolyard where children were bundled in coats, their breath little clouds. They slowed for a second when they saw the uniforms and the strange group behind Whitaker. One boy stared at Ingrid the way children stare at animals they have only seen in books. A girl tugged his sleeve and whispered something. Ingrid expected a word like enemy. Instead, the boy raised his hand, not a salute, just a child's uncertain wave. Ingrid did not wave back. Her fingers stayed still at her sides. Yet her chest tightened as if it had been touched. The girl's teacher stepped forward quickly, placing herself between the children and the sidewalk, her voice calm but firm as she guided them away. Not panic, not outrage, just control. Ingrid realized the teacher was protecting the children from the moment, and also protecting the moment from the children. Whitaker kept walking as if he had not seen any of it. Only when they turned the corner did he speak, his German careful. "Do not answer to anyone," he said. "Not even if they are kind. You stay quiet. You stay together." Ingrid heard something in his tone then, something she had not recognized earlier. It was not suspicion of them. It was respect for the thin line that kept a public street from becoming a courtroom. They approached a low brick building with a loading bay and stacks of wooden crates outside. A faded sign suggested it had once been a small factory or warehouse. Now it looked like a place that had been repurposed for whatever the war needed: sorting, packing, repairing. A man in coveralls stood near the door with a clipboard. He watched them approach, then looked at Whitaker with the expression of someone who wanted the job done without questions. Ingrid knew that face. It existed in every country. Whitaker spoke to him in English, brief and businesslike. The man nodded and opened the door wider. Warm air drifted out, smelling of paper, oil, and something like soap. Inside, tables were lined up with bundles of fabric and boxes of supplies. It was work that required hands, not opinions. Ingrid's shoulders eased a fraction. Work was safer than waiting. Waiting gave fear room to grow. The women were positioned at stations, each given a simple task demonstrated by a woman already working there, someone local with sleeves rolled up and hair pinned back. The local woman did not smile. She did not glare, either. She simply pointed, showed the motion, then stepped back, as if the world could be kept orderly by clear instructions. Ingrid began to fold and sort, repeating the movements until her hands remembered them better than her mind did. The rhythm steadied her. Fold, stack, tie, count. The sound of paper and cloth became a soft background, almost comforting. Whitaker stood near the entrance, watching the room like a man assigned to keep trouble from forming. Ingrid caught him glancing at the workers, then at the windows, then at the door again. He was not guarding them like dangerous animals. He was guarding the situation, the way a person guards a fire from spreading. After 20 minutes, Ingrid realized she had not heard a single insult. No laughter, no whispered threats, only work and the occasional scrape of a chair and the distant sound of a truck passing outside. That should have made her grateful. Instead, it made her wary, because her mind kept searching for the delayed payment, the hidden cost. Her fingers moved faster, as if speed could buy safety. Then a small accident happened, harmless but sudden. A bundle slipped from someone's hands, paper scattering across the floor like pale leaves. The room froze for half a second. Ingrid felt the old instinct rise, the certainty that a mistake would be punished. She stopped breathing. The local woman nearest the spill bent down without a word and began to gather the papers calmly, as if it was nothing. One of the German women crouched to help, hands shaking. Their fingers brushed once, a brief contact, and both women pulled back as if surprised by their own humanity. The local woman did not flinch. She simply handed the papers over, stack by stack, keeping the edges aligned. Ingrid watched that small exchange and understood something new. Kindness here was not always a dramatic act. Sometimes it was just the refusal to turn a mistake into a weapon. Whitaker saw it, too. He did not intervene. He only exhaled, slow, as if some tightness in his chest had loosened. Ingrid returned to her station, and her hands kept working, but her mind was no longer asking whether the city was a trap. It was asking a different question, quieter and more dangerous. What if the trap had been the story she brought with her, and the only way out was to admit it? By late morning, the warehouse had settled into a rhythm that felt almost like a promise. Hands moved. Paper whispered. Twine tightened around neat stacks. The local workers spoke to each other in low voices that rose only when a question needed an answer. Ingrid kept her head down and let the work pull her forward, one small motion at a time, because small motions were the only kind of future she trusted. Every so often she felt Whitaker's presence at the edge of the room, not looming, just there, like a post in the ground. She learned the sound of his boots without meaning to. She learned that he shifted his weight when the door opened, and that he relaxed again when it was only a delivery man with a hand truck. That pattern did something strange to Ingrid's nerves. It did not make her comfortable. It made her less afraid of surprises. Around noon, a whistle blew outside, distant and brief, and the local workers began to wash their hands at a metal sink, drying them on rough towels. Ingrid's stomach tightened. In her world, midday breaks were not gifts. They were opportunities for someone to decide you had done something wrong. Whitaker stepped forward, checking his watch, then spoke in German, simple and clear. Break, he said. 10 minutes. Drink water. Eat if you have food. Ingrid blinked. 10 minutes sounded precise, fair, almost civilian. The women gathered near their table, unsure where to stand. A crate near the wall had a tin water pitcher and a row of paper cups. One of the German women reached for a cup, then froze as if she expected a hand to slap it away. Nothing happened. She filled it and drank, eyes half closed, as if drinking was an act of courage. Ingrid took a cup too, careful not to spill. The water tasted metallic, but it was cold, and it cleared the taste of fear from her mouth. Whitaker walked to the door and spoke briefly with the man in coveralls, then stepped outside for a moment, returning with a small brown bag tucked under his arm. Ingrid watched his hands. The bag was not marked. It could have held anything. Her mind tried to sharpen into suspicion again, because suspicion was safer than hope. Whitaker set the bag on a table away from the workstations, then reached inside, and brought out a few items. Apples, plain sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, and a small box of crackers. He did not announce them. He did not say they were for the prisoners. He simply placed them in a neat line, like supplies issued for a task. Then he looked at the women and nodded once, as if the choice was theirs. Ingrid felt her throat tighten. Food was never just food in a camp. Food was a lever. Food was a test. Yet Whitaker's face remained plain, almost tired, like a man who had learned that doing one decent thing did not require a speech. Greta stepped forward first, drawn by hunger and fear in equal measure. She stopped a foot from the table, hands hovering. Whitaker did not move. Greta took an apple, then retreated quickly, as if she had stolen it. Ingrid watched her fingers tremble as she turned the fruit over, searching for something hidden. There was nothing. An apple is an apple in every language. Ingrid surprised herself by stepping forward next. She did not reach for the sandwich. That felt too intimate, too much like being cared for. She chose a cracker instead, the smallest thing. Her fingers brushed the cardboard edge, and she felt a jolt of shame at how cautious she had become. She turned away and walked back to her station. Cracker held like a coin. She ate it slowly, letting the salt settle on her tongue. It tasted like the ocean she had never seen, like distant places that existed no matter what uniforms said. While the women ate in silence, a local worker approached their table, a middle-aged woman with a firm mouth and sleeves rolled tight. She carried a small tin of sewing needles and a spool of thread. She set them down without speaking, then pointed to a frayed strap on one of the supply bags, demonstrating with quick hands how to reinforce the seam. Ingrid followed the motion, fingers moving carefully. The local woman watched for a second, then gave a tiny nod that could have meant approval. Ingrid felt heat rise in her face, a reaction she could not control. Approval used to come only from officers, and it always had a cost. This nod felt like a fact, like gravity. When the 10 minutes ended, Whitaker tapped his watch and said, "Back to work. No punishment. No trick." The women returned to folding and stacking, and Ingrid's hands were steadier than before. Still, a tension sat behind her ribs, because kindness did not erase the war. It only made the war harder to explain. She kept working, but now she noticed something else. Whitaker was not only watching them. He was watching the room, watching the locals, watching the thin places where fear could turn into a scene. He was managing two kinds of danger at once, and he did it with silence. Ingrid realized then that restraint was a form of strength she had rarely witnessed. In her world, power proved itself by taking. Here, at least in this small brick building, power proved itself by not taking what it could. In the early afternoon, the light through the warehouse windows turned thin and slanted, and Ingrid began to feel time again, not as a threat, but as a sequence. Fold, stack, tie, count. The repetition did not erase the fact that she was a prisoner, but it made the hours behave. She noticed that the local workers had started to treat the Germans like a fixed part of the room, the way one accepts a new machine after it has proven it will not explode. They still watched sometimes, especially when a box was moved or a door opened, but the watching had softened into caution instead of contempt. Ingrid did not mistake that for friendship. She had learned to be careful with the word. Friendship was too fragile for a place built on uniforms. Still, something had shifted. The silence was no longer a wall. It was a bridge made of small choices. Then a new sound entered the building, cutting through the steady hush. Footsteps that did not match Whitaker's. Faster, heavier, paired with a voice in English that carried impatience, not loud enough to be a shout, but sharp enough to make heads turn. Ingrid's shoulders tightened. She did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. The man who came in wore a uniform too, but his posture was different. His cap sat rigid on his head. His jaw looked locked as if it had been trained to stay that way. He glanced at the Germans first, then at the locals, then back at the Germans, as if counting them with suspicion. Ingrid's pulse rose. She kept her hands moving, because stillness was what fear demanded, and she refused to feed it. Whitaker stepped forward immediately, placing himself between the newcomer and the work tables without making a show of it. He spoke in English, quick and controlled. Ingrid caught only a few sounds, but she saw the exchange in their faces. The newcomer's mouth tightened. He gestured with two fingers toward the women, like someone pointing at a mess that should not be allowed indoors. The local man in coveralls looked down at his clipboard, pretending to check numbers. The local woman with the needles kept threading and unthreading her spool, eyes fixed on her hands. The room held its breath without meaning to. Whitaker did not raise his voice. He did not step back. He did something Ingrid had never seen an authority figure do in her world. He lowered the temperature. He spoke slower. He used fewer words. He made his body calm on purpose, as if calm were a tool. The newcomer looked past Whitaker at Ingrid, and Ingrid felt the old heat of shame, the reflex to become smaller. She refused. She kept her chin level, eyes down but not broken. She did not glare. She did not plead. She simply existed. Whitaker shifted slightly, blocking the line of sight more fully. The newcomer said something that made Whitaker's brow crease, then relax. Whitaker reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded paper, probably an order, and held it out without flourish. The newcomer took it and scanned it, his eyes moving left to right, then back again, as if searching for permission to be angry. His lips pressed together. He handed the paper back with a quick motion that said he did not like being corrected by ink. He spoke again, a short sentence. Whitaker answered with one of his own. The newcomer's eyes flicked toward the door, then to the workers, then to the German women. Finally, he gave a small shrug that looked like surrender disguised as annoyance, and he left. The door shut. The room exhaled. Ingrid did not realize she had been holding her breath until her lungs hurt. For a moment, no one moved. Then, almost in unison, the local workers returned to their tasks, as if the safest response to tension was to deny it the dignity of attention. Ingrid's fingers resumed their rhythm. But her mind was not on the paper anymore. It was on Whitaker. He had not defended her with kindness alone. He had defended the rules, the fragile structure that kept a warehouse from becoming a stage for vengeance. He had done it without smiling, without heroics, without demanding gratitude. Greta whispered, barely audible. Was he angry because we are here? Ingrid did not answer right away. She watched Whitaker return to his post by the door, shoulders squared again, face neutral again, as if nothing had happened. Then Ingrid said the only truth she could safely offer. He was angry, she whispered back, because he wanted a different kind of day. The words surprised her as she spoke them. A different kind of day. That was what kindness looked like here. Not a grand confession, but the insistence that even prisoners could be moved through a city without becoming entertainment. Ingrid felt something settle in her chest. Not comfort, not trust, but a clearer understanding. This place did not protect her because she deserved it. It protected her because someone believed standards mattered more than moods. And for the first time since the truck had rolled into town, Ingrid understood that restraint was not weakness. It was a decision made over and over again, in rooms where everyone was tempted to choose the easier thing. The afternoon stretched on, and the warehouse grew quieter in the way places do when people have decided to finish what they started. The local workers stopped glancing at the Germans as often. The women stopped flinching at every new sound. Ingrid kept folding and tying with steady hands, but her attention stayed tuned to the door, not because she wanted to escape, but because she had learned that the thin places in a day were where the truth showed itself. Whitaker remained near the entrance, posture composed, eyes moving in slow sweeps that missed nothing. He did not look at Ingrid directly, yet she could feel the boundary he maintained around the group, invisible but real. Once, when a delivery boy pushed a cart too close to their table, Whitaker stepped aside and redirected him with a quiet word. So calm the boy barely registered he had been corrected. That calm had weight. It changed the shape of the room without making a scene. By mid-afternoon, the man in coveralls checked his clipboard and spoke to Whitaker again. Whitaker nodded, looked at his watch, then walked toward the German women. "We finish this stack," he said in German. "Then we go back." The phrase "go back" landed in Ingrid's chest with two meanings at once. It meant return to the truck, return to the camp, return to the fences. It also meant something else now, return with evidence. The evidence was not dramatic. It was not a photograph. It was not a confession. It was a series of ordinary moments that did not fit the story she had been given. Ingrid forced herself to keep her eyes on the paper, to finish the stack without rushing, because rushing was a kind of panic. She wanted to leave with dignity intact, not as someone fleeing a miracle. The last bundle was tied. The last box was stacked. The local woman with the needles gathered her thread and set the tin back on a shelf. Then, unexpectedly, she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small item, holding it between two fingers. A button, plain, dark, with 4 holes, the kind found on work coats. She walked it over and placed it on the table near Ingrid's station. Ingrid stared at it. A button was nothing. A button was also a sign that someone had noticed a missing piece and cared enough to replace it. The local woman tapped Ingrid's frayed cuff once, then tapped the button, then walked away without waiting for a response. Ingrid felt her face warm again, an emotion she did not have a name for anymore. Gratitude was complicated. Gratitude could become weakness. Still, the button sat there like a quiet truth. Whitaker motioned for the women to form up. They did, silently, line tightening again, boots aligning with practice. As they moved toward the door, Ingrid saw the man in coveralls watching them with an expression that had softened from suspicion into something like reluctant acceptance. He did not wave. He did not speak. He simply stepped aside and let them pass. Outside, the sky had shifted toward late day, the light colder, the air sharper. Ingrid heard the distant sound of a train horn and felt a strange ache in her chest, because motion now suggested possibility. The group walked back through the same streets, but the streets felt different the second time. Not kinder, not safer, just more real. People still glanced. A few stared, yet no one approached. No one shouted. A woman pushing a stroller paused, watched the line pass, then adjusted a blanket over the child's legs and continued on. The gesture was so domestic it felt almost unreal. Whitaker kept a steady pace, eyes forward. Ingrid noticed a small smear of ink on his thumb, likely from the paper he had shown the other soldier earlier. It reminded her that his authority had limits too, and that he spent part of his day defending rules from other men in his own uniform. As they neared the curb where the truck waited, Greta whispered, "Will it be the same next time?" Ingrid did not know. She did not promise. Promises were dangerous. She answered with the only certainty the day had earned. It was real today, she said softly. The truck door opened. The women climbed in. Ingrid stepped up last, and as she settled onto the wooden bench, she looked once more at the city without letting her eyes linger too long. The shop windows glowed in the fading light. The sidewalks still carried people with their own errands and worries. The war had not stopped, but neither had life. Whitaker pulled the canvas flap down, not sealing them into darkness, just closing the opening against the cold. Before he latched it, his voice came through, low and even. "You did well," he said in German, as if work deserved recognition, not because they were prisoners, but because they were human beings who had done a task. Ingrid did not answer. Her throat would not allow it. She only held the small button in her palm, the edges pressing lightly into her skin, and she let that simple pressure remind her that dignity could be given back in pieces, quietly, without anyone asking permission. The truck rolled back toward the camp with a steadier sound than it had in the morning, as if even the tires had learned the route. Ingrid sat with her knees together and her hands folded over the small button in her palm, closing her fingers around it whenever the road jolted, not to keep from dropping it, but to remind herself the day had not been imagined. The other women spoke in whispers now, cautious and quick, as if the words might leak out through the canvas and be punished. Greta leaned close, her breath warm against Ingrid's ear. "They did not bind us," she murmured, and her voice carried a tremor that was half relief and half disbelief. Ingrid did not answer immediately. She listened to the sounds outside the flap, the city fading into countryside, the occasional honk of a car, the distant clatter of something metal, ordinary noises that did not feel like a threat. Her mind kept returning to the bell above the coffee shop door, the way it rang without judgment. She thought of the local woman's nod, the button placed on the table like a silent sentence. She thought of Whitaker standing between them and the other soldier, not as a savior, but as a man insisting that a standard mattered even when no one would praise him for it. Ingrid realized she had been bracing for cruelty the way a person braces for winter, convinced it was the only season that existed. Today had been a different season. Not summer, not comfort. Something like early spring, cold still present, but the air carrying proof that change was possible. When the truck slowed near the camp gates, Ingrid felt the old tightening in her stomach, the body's memory of fences and rules. The canvas flap lifted. The light outside looked harsher here, stripped of storefront warmth. Guards stood in familiar positions. The women filed out in silence. Ingrid stepped down last, the button now hidden in her pocket like contraband that could not be named. She expected someone to notice, to demand it, to turn her small treasure into a lesson. No one did. The day's details were already being swallowed by routine. They were counted. They were directed back toward their barracks. The camp smelled of damp ground and boiled food, a smell that had become its own kind of weather. Inside the barracks, the air was close, filled with the soft sounds of bodies settling and the scrape of boots on wooden floors. Ingrid sat on her bunk and stared at her sleeve cuff, frayed and thin. The button would not fix it yet. It would fix it later. That was part of what made it precious. It belonged to a future, not only to survival. Greta sat beside her, eyes wide, voice still small. "Why would they do that?" she asked. "Why would they give us coffee? Why would they let us walk?" Ingrid could have answered with the old language, the old explanations meant to keep the world simple. She could have said it was strategy. She could have said it was deception. She could have said it meant nothing. But the taste of coffee had been real. The nod had been real. The calm voice saying 5 minutes had been real. Ingrid looked down at her hands, then at Greta. "Because they can," she said finally, and the words sounded strange even to her. "Because they have the power to bind us, and today they chose not to." Greta frowned, as if trying to fit the thought into a shape she recognized. "Then what are we?" she whispered. Ingrid felt the question like a needle. Prisoners. Enemies. Women in uniforms that marked them as the losing side. Yet today, in the middle of an American street, she had been treated like someone whose dignity mattered enough to protect. Ingrid reached into her pocket and brought out the button, holding it on her open palm so Greta could see. It looked almost ridiculous there, small and plain. Greta stared, then touched it lightly with one fingertip, as if it might vanish. Ingrid closed her hand again, not possessive, just careful. "We are still us," Ingrid said. "And they are still them." She paused, letting the silence do the work words could not. But perhaps the story about them was incomplete. Outside, a whistle sounded somewhere in the camp, signaling the next routine, the next controlled hour. The barracks quieted. Ingrid lay back on her bunk and stared at the ceiling boards, counting the knots in the wood like stars. She could still smell coffee if she tried, faint and impossible. She realized then that the most dangerous thing that had happened to her all day was not walking unbound through a city. It was learning that her fear had been trained, and that training could be undone. She did not know what would happen tomorrow. She only knew this. A standard had been shown to her without shouting, and once you have seen a standard, you cannot pretend the old excuses are the only truth. Morning came without mercy, thin light slipping through the cracks of the barracks like it was searching for something to accuse. Ingrid woke before the whistle, not because she was disciplined, but because her mind refused to sleep in peace now that it had seen a different kind of day. Around her, the room stirred with quiet movements, blankets folded, boots found, faces arranged into the careful neutrality that kept the tension away. Greta's eyes met Ingrid's for a moment, then dropped, as if even hope was something that had to be hidden. Ingrid felt the button in her pocket and resisted the urge to touch it. She had learned that the smallest objects could become anchors, and she did not want to cling to an anchor so hard that it pulled her under. The whistle sounded. The day began again. Hours later, the truck returned for another work detail, and Ingrid's stomach tightened the same way it had yesterday. She watched the canvas flap, watched the space where the city would appear, and waited for the world to correct itself with harshness. When the truck stopped and the door opened, she saw Whitaker again. He looked the same as before, uniform neat, watch on his wrist, face set in that calm that did not beg for approval. Yet Ingrid noticed something different. He looked tired in a more honest way, like a man who had slept but not rested. He counted the women with a glance, then spoke in German, steady and unadorned. Same rules, he said. Stay together. Stay quiet. You work, then you go back. Ingrid stepped down, boots meeting pavement, and for a second her body waited to be restrained. Nothing touched her wrists. The air smelled of coffee again somewhere nearby, faint but real. The city moved around them as it had yesterday, not kind, not cruel, just living. That was when Ingrid understood the deeper truth. What had happened was not an exception. It was a policy. It was a choice made by people who believed order could exist without humiliation. They walked past the schoolyard again. Children still played. A teacher still guided them back with calm authority. Ingrid kept her gaze forward, but she felt the moment settle in her chest like a new kind of weight, heavier than fear because it demanded responsibility. In the warehouse, work resumed. The local woman with the needles did not speak, but she placed a spool of thread within Ingrid's reach as if it belonged there. Ingrid stitched her cuff during a brief pause, sliding the button through the frayed fabric with careful fingers. The thread tightened. The cuff held. It was a small repair, almost laughable compared to the size of the war, yet Ingrid felt her throat tighten as if she had built something sacred. She had not fixed the world. She had fixed a seam. That was enough to prove she still had agency. Later, when a box needed to be moved and the local man in coveralls pointed toward Ingrid's side of the table, Whitaker watched the motion and then looked away, signaling trust without saying the word. Ingrid lifted the box with another woman, their steps measured. It was not heavy, perhaps 20 pounds, but carrying it across the room without being shouted at felt like carrying proof. At the end of the shift, Whitaker brought the women out and formed them into their line. As they walked back toward the truck, Ingrid saw the other soldier from yesterday across the street, leaning near a corner, watching with the same disapproval. His eyes slid over Ingrid like she was a stain. Ingrid felt the old heat of shame rise, then falter. Shame requires agreement. She did not agree anymore. Whitaker noticed him too. He did not confront him. He did something quieter and stronger. He kept the line steady, kept the pace even, kept the rules intact. The city remained a city. The sidewalk remained a sidewalk. The prisoners remained unbound. Back at the truck, Ingrid paused 1/2 second before climbing in, not to delay, not to provoke, but to take in the scene with clear eyes. She understood now that kindness was not a feeling floating in the air. It was a standard enforced in small moments by people like Whitaker and protected by ordinary citizens who refused to turn prisoners into entertainment. Ingrid climbed in and sat with her hands folded, not because she was afraid of moving, but because she had learned a different kind of discipline. Across from her, Greta's eyes shone with the fragile light of someone who had stopped expecting the worst at every turn. Whitaker pulled the canvas flap down and latched it. His voice came through one last time, low and matter-of-fact. "Keep doing your work," he said in German. "That is how you get through." The truck started forward. Ingrid felt the motion and realized the true reversal was not that she had walked through an American city without restraints. The reversal was that she had been shown a world where power could choose restraint, and that knowledge would travel with her long after the road ended. She did not raise her voice. She raised her standard.